So a few years ago, somebody decided to do like a scientific study to figure out where the middle of nowhere was. And the method that they decided to use to do this was to figure out what place in the United States was the furthest away from any Starbucks. Starbucks, obviously, being the quintessential embodiment of what it is to be civilized and live in civilization. So they went around and they plotted where all the Starbucks were, and they plotted on a map what place in the world is the furthest away from any possible cup of, venti cup of non-fat milk, right? And the answer was Circle, Montana. Surprising nobody, especially any of us who were blessed to grow up in eastern Montana. Now, I actually grew up in Miles City, Montana, which is about 90 miles from Circle. So we didn't quite live in the middle of nowhere, but you could definitely see middle of nowhere from where it is that we lived. Which gives you a different perspective on growing up, and it means that you are, given, say, different opportunities and have different challenges that otherwise you would not have. One of the things that growing up, especially once you kind of get into middle school and high school, when it starts to become a huge value to be able to express yourself in some way, that can become a challenging proposition when you live in a community where there are literally only three places to buy things. Right? Especially when it came to clothing. It either came from JCPenney, it came from Kmart, or it came from the local Western wear store. And that was about it, right? And so not only did everybody dress pretty much largely the same, but you pretty much knew exactly where anybody got anything, because there were quite simply not that many options. Now, the one kind of reprieve that you would have from this growing up is if you were lucky enough to get to travel outside of Miles City and maybe go to one of those far-off mythical places that only existed in television shows at the time, of course, known as the mall. The closest mall to us was actually the Rimrock Mall in Billings, Montana, which was still about 150 miles away, in the age of the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, nonetheless. The whole no speed limit thing wouldn't come till later. And so it was a 2.5-hour journey one way to go there. We did not make that journey often ourselves as a family, and a lot of families didn't unless you had a reason to. But there were sometimes these brief little fun moments when you would participate in an activity that would let you go to these far-off and far-flung places. In fact, I'm pretty sure in high school it was a recruiting tactic for various clubs and organizations to point out how many times you'd get to ride the school bus at the designated 55-mile-an-hour speed limit to Billings during whatever season that you were in. And it was just taken as a given, I'm sure, by all of the adults that were planning these trips, that if you were going to do this, you had to allocate at least 1 3-hour block of time for us to spend at the mall, where they basically just dropped us off like feral cats and came back and picked us up 3 hours later. I'm pretty sure the adults didn't even stick around. But we were fine. So this presented an opportunity and a challenge for people in that situation, because again, this is the internet. For the younger people now, the internet doesn't exist. Amazon didn't exist. There was no magic box that brought you things from far off places, or anything like that. So this was like your one opportunity to go and see and participate and shop at places and see things that you would otherwise never get to see. And there was a lot of conversation both before and there among people about where they were going to spend their time and what strategic purchases they were going to make. And oftentimes, if you kind of peeled back the layers of the conversation, is what do I want to get here that I cannot get at home that will set me apart? What is the thing I want to get here that I cannot get the home that will help me make my mark? What am I going to get here that I can get home that all of my friends are going to go, ooh, where'd you get that? That's at least what everybody else was doing. The other thing that the mall had was also the only arcade within 150 miles of Miles City, Montana. So I usually spent the money that I was allocated on Cinnabon and Tekken 2. So I didn't bring home a lot of souvenirs. We like to distinguish ourselves. Whether as people or as individuals, we like to have things that we understand to be us, right? We all have this thing that we are projecting out of the world. We all have this way that we want to be seen in the world. Now, some of the way that some of us want to be seen in the world is to not be seen in the world. Some of us do all we can to blend into the background and do as little as possible to stand out because we don't like standing out. Some of us like to stand out and stand in front and talk to people. I have the best job. I've said that several times this week. People look at me like I'm crazy, like this is the best job. And there are different ways to do that. And I think one of the things that we are tapping into there, and it's actually an important thing and a good thing, is this reality that God made each of us different. We are all made distinct. We are all made beautifully and wonderfully, and we all have things that make us us. Even if you are an identical twin, even identical twins are not fully identical, right? I know that because I can tell them apart, Hills. Sometimes I mess it up. They're not here, so I'll confess that. All right. But we all have these things. And so there is this thing inside of us, right, that we know is us and we know is our expression, and we like to let that out. And I think we live in a time where that is even more celebrated than it was even before. Because as amazing and distinctive as 90s fashion was that we got to get at the Rimrock Mall, like, yeah, are you more Rachel? Are you more like are you a Fresh Prince? I was not a Fresh Prince. There was nothing fresh. I was nothing. I was still kind of debating whether, you were a Zach Morris or a Slater, right? Like that was my debate. So that's a deep cut. I know my friends now. All right. There's always a question for us is what makes us us? And what do we want to put out into the world? And how do we want people to know who we are and what it is that we care about? And when you were a kid, and especially when you were a kid, or in high school and middle school and those kind of places, oftentimes one of the ways that you do that is how you dress and the music that you listen to and all of that. It is about a lot more than what you just simply happen to enjoy. Those become for us at those times in our lives sort of defining attributes to who it is that we are. Wesley, because you knew it was coming to this. Wesley has a similar problem in a lot of ways 300 years earlier. He's got this group of people who are beginning to act in a different way, beginning to value different things, and beginning to stand out in the crowd amongst all the other people. And people come to him, and they repeatedly come to him to basically say, what is this thing that you were trying to do, and what makes it different? Why are you different? That you seem to be acting different. You seem to be behaving different. You talk about different things. Who are you? And Wesley wants to grab hold of this question right from the beginning and say, this is who he, as John, understands us to be. So very early in the Methodist movement, he writes a document that becomes one of those foundational documents that comes referred back to for a long time on the character of a Methodist. And what's interesting about his document and about this idea of what the character of a Methodist is, he starts off by saying not what we are, but what we are not. Part of what he's concerned about is that people will trivialize what it is that he's doing. That's just a group of people that just, looks a certain way or acts a certain way, and they're really not all that different than the rest of us. He doesn't want that. So he actually writes early in this document, when he talks about who we are as a people, he writes, we do not place our religion, our faith, or any part of it in being attached to any particular mode of speaking, any quaint or uncommon set of expressions. He basically says we are not people who speak in code. We are not people who speak in some foreign language or dialect or try to use fancy-sounding words, which is good because I don't know very many fancy words, to explain who we are. The most obvious, easy, common words wherein meaning can be conveyed, we prefer before all others, both ordinary occasions and when we speak of things of God. He had this radical idea that when we speak of God and those important subjects, we can still speak in a way that we speak every day. That God could actually hear us and understand us when we speak as we normally do, instead of speaking in some fancy or altered tone. This was actually a really, really big deal at the time, because there was this understanding that talking to God, especially talking to God through prayer, required the resuscitation of memorized verses and required the use of fancy, flowery language, and God would only hear us if the words had 6 syllables. And Wesley goes and says, actually, no, that's not what faith is about. Our faith is every day. God understands us however we speak to God, and we can speak to God however it is that we normally speak, because God is with us in the here and now. He also says it does not lie in the form of our apparel. Jesus doesn't care if the t-shirt came from the Gap or Kmart. That was a pretty good one. Come on. In the posture of our body, how we pray, or the covering of our heads, in the abstaining of marriage or nor from meats, which is good. Good one for me. Which are all good if received in thanksgiving. So the ways that we do not distinguish ourselves, we don't distinguish ourselves because we dress fancy. We don't distinguish ourselves because we talk fancy. We don't distinguish ourselves because we do fancy things, or we abstain from this thing, or we sacrifice in this way, or any of those sorts of things. That's not what it's about. Those outward expressions, those kind of more trivial outward expressions, is not what we are about, and not what Wesley wanted this movement to be about. It was about something far more important than that. And really, what Wesley was trying to bring to the surface were some universal ideas that he and many understood to be basic natures of what it is to be Christian. As we said at the beginning of worship this morning, what we're going to talk about over the 5 weeks, we cannot exclusively, nor should we exclusively claim as ours. In many ways, what Wesley was about was elevating those things that he felt were there from the very beginning, those values that Jesus put into the movement from the beginning, and how it is that all Christians should act. Because at this time and at this place, when Wesley is writing this, he is not intending to start a new denomination. That's not what he is doing. He is starting a movement to help people live more spiritually vibrant lives. And he actually doesn't particularly care very much whether they're part of the Church of England like he is, or whether they're Baptists, or whether they're Anabaptists, or whether they're Catholics, or who they are. What he is trying to bring out into the world is a way of living a more spiritually vibrant life, a more spiritually grounded life, grounded in the ways that Jesus actually taught us to live, and shed some of these outward signs that have built up around it. Now, one of the ways that he does this, and the way we're going to go throughout this week that he does this, is he roots what he's talking about very much in the here and now. That God is actually engaged with us in the here and now, that God cares about us in the here and now, and that God is seeking to be with us, and we are able to be with God in the here and now. This is a fairly probably not a very surprising statement for us today, but it was an incredibly radical statement in the time of Wesley. Because at the time of Wesley, the church and the state are pretty much one. The church is basically subservient to the king, and the king has a lot of motivations in life. And one of the things the king really cares about is keeping people where they belong. Because everyone else has to stay where they belong for the king to keep staying the king. And kings, if you don't know, are really interested in staying and continuing to be kings, which is why it was a really good idea of us not to have those, right? George Washington was on to something when they tried to make him king and he said, no, thank you, right? Because kings suddenly get very interested in staying king. So in order for the king to stay the king, everyone else has to stay where they are. And one of the ways that he did that, one of the ways that they did that is they used the church to do it. And they used the church to do it by getting people far more excited and interesting in what might happen in the next life in this. So they basically said, look, Jesus doesn't care. God doesn't care about what you're going through right now, but there's heaven there someday, and it's going to be great. So just keep putting up with what you're putting up with. Keep putting up with being put down. Keep putting up with all the hardships. Keep putting up with everything. Keep putting up with the high taxes. Keep putting up with everything. Keep putting up with people telling you what to do and where to go all the time. Keep putting up with not having any freedoms. Keep putting up with all of that. Because someday you're going to get to go to heaven and it's great. Wesley comes along and says, yes, someday we'll get to go to heaven and it's great. And God actually cares about what happens to us here. God cares about what happens to the here and now. God cares about the poor. God cares about the hungry. God cares about those who are sick. God cares about those who are in prison. God cares about how we're treated and how we treat others. God cares about all of that too. So yes, the next thing is great, but the place that we are now can also be a lot better if we can all decide and we all choose to make it so. Because as we talked about last week in our previous sermon series, at the end of the day, heaven isn't even far away. Heaven's coming here. Most people were challenged by what Wesley said. So Wesley starts off by telling everybody this is what we're not about. It's not about having the right clothes. It's not about having the right language. It's not about that. But here's what it is. And the thing that he starts with is this idea of God. That the first and foremost, what Christians are and what we do, the foundation on which we rest, is God's love. Both God's love for us and our love for God. Both of those things are important, and both of those things are the foundation on which everything else is built. Now, if you've been following along in our little book, and we have a few more, if you follow along in a little book for this chapter, and you read chapter 1, he talks about the fact in there that actually in the Bible, the Greek actually has 4 different words for love, and that all get translated in the English language as love. And in this case, the love that we are talking about is agape love. So in the Bible, that's the word you would find, and we just translate it generically as love. And I like the way that the author of the book talks about it, because there's different ways to understand and translate the word agape. It's not a word that we really have, so we kind of have to dance around it. And I love the way that he describes it, because he talks about agape love is the quality of the love is based on the lover, not on the one being loved. The quality of the love is based on the lover, God, not on the quality of the one being loved, us. It does not matter if we feel or we are lovable. The agape love that we have from God is not based on us, it is based on God. It is not earned. We don't deserve it. It isn't anything like that. It is there for us, just as Jesus said it was, always and everywhere. The choice isn't as if we earned it. The choice is as if we accept it. And that's a different thing. But in accepting God's love, we also have to understand that we have to accept it as it is and as it is offered, right? Because we are not in charge of that, God is. Right? So we cannot say, God, I will accept your love and I'm grateful for it. But clearly, obviously, we're going to have to put some parameters around this, right? I mean, it's like, truly, when you say you love me, of course you love me because I'm awesome. But you can't really mean those people over there too, can you? I'm sorry. No, I'm screwed either way. Over there. You can't truly mean those. And God says, no, you don't get to mess with the quality of it. You don't get to mess with what it is. The only choice is, do you want it or do you not? Do you want to accept it? Do you not? Now, back when I was a software engineer and going to school for that, my undergraduate degree, after I got out of Miles City and moved to the grand metropolis of Bozeman, Montana, which had its own mall, good times, with a giant stuffed polar bear at the entrance. I kid you not. There is. I could not find a picture of it. This is totally an aside. I went to the mall in Bozeman, Montana. There was behind glass, there was a giant taxidermied polar bear standing on top of a taxidermied seal, right? And as you went past that, in the main room, there was nothing but deer heads and elk heads like all around it. Like if you had any understanding of where you were, you're just like, okay. It's like, you wouldn't even have to tell you know what town you're in Montana. All right. Anyway. I wish I had a picture of it. I could not find one. It's gone now. I can't mention that. Anyway. But when I was in software, one of the things that was big at the time was the free software movement and the open source software movement and all that sort of stuff. And so we used to talk, and it was this kind of understanding of free software and open source software and all that. And eventually, though, there became to be a challenge of language, right? Because free can actually, like love, free can mean a couple of different things. right? And so at one point, one of the kind of leaders of the free software movement came out, named Richard Stallman, came out with this great quote. He says, when you think of free software, you have to think of, let's see, do we have it? Because I didn't write it down. There you go. You have to think free speech, not free beer. And basically what he meant by that was, think free speech. Free speech is our ability to basically say what we want within reason. The whole nobody's allowed to shout fire in a crowded theater, right? But outside of that, we're generally allowed to say what we want when we want. Now, we're not free of consequences of that. Some of the things we say, people take offense to, and we have to deal with the consequence of that and all that sort of stuff. But free speech means generally that we can kind of do what we want when we want, including taking things like Richard Stallman quotes completely out of context and mangling them, right? I'm allowed to do that, whether he wants me to or not. Versus this idea of somebody giving you a free beer. It's great to have a free beer, but you're sort of limited, right? You can either take it or not, and you can use it as intended or not. I suppose you could wash your car with it. I don't know. But you can't change the beer, right? I mean, it just is what it is. So in software, they talked about the idea of free software as in stuff that you can go and download and use, right? Like Chrome or any of those sorts of things, Google or Facebook today, right? It's something free, we can use it, but we can't change it, right? We don't get to get inside the code. We don't get to look under the hood. We don't get to say, oh, this piece of software runs on this platform, but it doesn't run on this platform, so I'm going to make it run on that platform by changing the code. We don't have access to it, right? So free software, that is the software that you can actually get the source code and change and do all this kind of crazy stuff with that I used to do for fun. It was fun. Thanks, Chris. He talked about that as the idea as free as in free speech. Now, I'm not going to say that God's love is like beer, but I kind of am. All right. That is sort of the way that we are asked to approach this, right? And Wesley understands God's love is God's love. It is there and it is present and it is never changing. It's been the same since it was from the beginning, as it is now, as it will be in the future. God's love is what it is. God's love is what it is. It is for us, as it is for everybody. The choice we have is not how we can change it. The choice we have is how we can accept it and how we can use it in our lives. That is the choice, which is an incredibly, in some ways, I think, freeing thing. It frees us from so many things. It frees us from wondering and having to stress and concern ourselves like, well, did I do the right things? Did I say the right prayers? Did I talk to the right people? Am I saying the right words? Am I using the wrong words? Am I wearing the right clothes? Am I not wearing the right clothes? Am I going to church often enough? No, you're probably not. That's for me. That's not God. No, I'm just kidding. We can free ourselves from all of those cares and concerns and concentrate on something far more important, which is there is this thing called God's love. It is the foundation on which everything is built. My only choice now is what to do with it. Now, he spends a lot of time in the book talking about this idea of a foundation, right? And we definitely do understand that this is the first thing John Wesley mentions, this idea that what is the mark of a Methodist? A Methodist loves God. What is the mark of Methodist? A Methodist loves God. That is the foundation on which we are built, for sure. And that's why it gets listed first. Now, that does not necessarily mean that that's the first thing that happens for us. What's interesting is Wesley says this. Wesley says the foundation is God's love, certainly and forever it is. But in the first many years of Wesley's life, in the first many years of the Methodist movement, Wesley himself would admit he didn't really actually even understand God's love. He didn't really understand what it meant, and he really didn't understand that it was for him. And yet he was still going about the work. So this is one of the things I need to tell you, because sometimes as Christians we can fall into this trap and we can say, oh, well, I'm not sure I feel God's love at this moment, or I don't feel I feel God's love completely, thus I don't have to worry about any of the rest of this, right? I don't have to worry about loving my neighbor until I've got God's love straight in my heart. Well, no, I'm sorry. I'm not letting you off the hook that easy, and neither is Jesus, right? The two things go together. And sometimes what it's easier to do, because God's love can be hard to wrap our heads around and hard to experience and hard to really grasp what it really and truly means, Sometimes the best way that we actually learn and experience God's love is by first loving our neighbor and first doing some of the other things that we're going to talk about in this worship series. So this is one of the things, my cautionary tale for you. You may be feeling, because I have felt this in my life certainly on many occasions, where God's love does not feel as present as I would like it to be. God's love does not feel as close as I would like it to be. God's love doesn't feel as strong as I'd like it to be. And sometimes I wonder if I even know what this God love thing is about. We all deal with that sometimes. That's part of a faith journey for pretty much everybody. That does not mean we give up on the whole project. And it does not mean we put everything else on hold. Sometimes the best way to rekindle our sense of God's love is to go about all the other things that God calls us to, including loving our neighbor and loving ourselves. Because it is hard to understand that God loves us and loves those around us if we don't ourselves love those around us and love ourselves. So yes, the foundation we are built on, and the thing that we really cannot do without, is God's love for us and our love for God. But things may come in different places, and different things may be important at different times. Because sometimes, to stretch the analogy, sometimes when the foundation is built, there's other work being done in other places. The walls are being built over here, and the plumbing's being done over here, and this is all being done over there, at different places at different times. And when it comes together, certainly without the foundation, there will be no house. It does not mean it's the only thing that's happening at the moment. So for the next 5 weeks, we're going to explore what it is to have the marks of a Methodist. And really what we're exploring is what does it be to have the marks of a Christian that's trying to follow in the ways and example of Christ. Wesley says, first and foremost, it's about love and accepting this idea that we are loved and lovable, not because we are special, but because God is. So this isn't about how we dress. It doesn't matter if you grew up being able to go to the mall every day, even though I'm a little jealous of you. If you had an arcade, that's it. Or if you grew up in the middle of nowhere, doing what you could with the JCPenney catalog to get what you need. Doesn't matter what music you're listening to. It doesn't matter what TV shows you're watching, though there's some out there that's just junk. Don't watch it. It doesn't. What matters is where our heart is and who has it. God loves us. That love is there. That love is real. It is unchanging no matter what we do. The only question is, do we accept it? Amen.